There was a woman who came to my consulting room many years ago. She was by every outward measure a successful person, articulate, intelligent, refined in her manners. And yet she could not enter a crowded room without feeling that she might collapse. She told me, with a strange kind of shame, that she always knew what other people were feeling before they themselves had named it. At funerals, she wept for strangers. At dinner parties, she absorbed the silent rage of married couples until her own chest tightened. She had been told since childhood that she was too sensitive, and she had come to believe this sensitivity was a defect, a small, persistent illness of the soul. I listened to her for a long time, and then I told her something that surprised her. I said, "What you carry is not a sickness. It is an ancient inheritance. You have not been cursed with weakness. You have been entrusted with a function most of humanity has forgotten how to use." She wept, not from sadness, from the relief of being seen. I have written and spoken of many things in my life, of dreams, of archetypes, of the long descent into the unconscious that I called individuation. But of all the souls who passed through my work, the ones we now call empaths have always seemed to me the most misunderstood. They were called nervous, they were called hysterical, they were called too soft for this world, and yet they were carrying something the modern world had buried alive, the capacity to feel the soul of another, to know without being told. So sit with me a moment. The fire is warm, the night is long. Tonight I want to speak with you not as a doctor diagnosing a condition, not as a teacher delivering a lecture, but as someone who has spent a lifetime walking the borderlands between the seen and the unseen. What the empath carries is no minor thing. It is a thread that connects us back to the oldest layer of the human psyche, the layer I once called the collective unconscious. And what I have to tell you may change the way you understand yourself. The first thing that must be said is that empathy, in the way most people speak of it today, is far too small a word. The modern world has reduced it to a kind of polite courtesy, the ability to imagine what another person might be feeling, the way one might imagine the weather in a city one has never visited. This is not what the empath does. The empath does not imagine the storm. The empath stands inside it. There is in the depths of the psyche a phenomenon I observed again and again in my patients and in my own dreams. I came to call it, borrowing a phrase from the anthropologist Lévi-Brühl, *participation mystique*, a mystical participation. It is the state in which the boundary between self and other becomes thin, almost translucent. In primitive societies, the entire tribe lived in this condition. They did not experience themselves as isolated individuals locked behind the walls of a private skull. They experienced themselves as participants in a shared field of being. The grief of one was the grief of all. The dead were not gone, they were simply less visible. The empath, I came to understand, has not lost access to this older mode of perception. While the rest of modern humanity has built thick fortresses around the ego, necessary fortresses for survival in a brutal age, the empath's walls remained porous. The world flowed in, the world flowed out. And the empath, often without understanding why, lived perpetually in a condition that the average person experiences only in moments of love, grief, or great art. But here begins the darkest game of the unconscious, because what flows in is not always one's own. I want you to consider this carefully. Most empaths I have worked with believed, for the greater part of their lives, that the emotions they felt were theirs. They felt anxious in a meeting and assumed they themselves were anxious. They felt grief in a hospital corridor and assumed they themselves were grieving. They felt rage at a family table and assumed they themselves were enraged. And so they spent their years carrying the psychic weather of every room they entered, mistaking it for their own internal climate. They medicated emotions that were never theirs. They built their identities around storms that had blown in from elsewhere. This is the first great task of the empath, to learn to ask of every powerful feeling that arises, *, whose is this? Asterisk, it is a simple question. it is also a revolutionary one, because the moment one begins to ask it, the entire architecture of the inner life begins to shift. One discovers, sometimes with shock, that a great deal of what one has been carrying does not belong to oneself at all. But the most surprising part is yet to come, because the gift is not in the receiving. The gift is in what the empath does with what has been received. Let me speak now of the ancient mirror, because no understanding of the empathic soul is complete without it. In nearly every mythological tradition I have studied, there appears a particular figure. Sometimes she is a priestess, sometimes she is a seer or a shaman, sometimes the figure is a wounded healer, like Chiron, the centaur, who could heal others but never himself. Sometimes the figure is the prophet, who speaks truths no one wishes to hear, like Cassandra, condemned to see the future and to be disbelieved by all. In the Egyptian mysteries, there were the priestesses of Isis, who were said to weep the tears of the world. In the shamanic traditions of Siberia and the Americas, there were those chosen by spirit, often through illness or madness, to walk between the worlds and bring back what was needed for the tribe. What did all these figures share? They shared a particular kind of porousness. They were not rewarded with comfortable lives. They suffered. They were often feared, often exiled, often misunderstood. And yet the tribe could not survive without them. They were the ones who could feel the wound before it became visible. The empath in our age is the inheritor of this lineage. But the tragedy is that our age has no temple for them. There is no initiatory tradition that takes the young empath aside and says, "Asterisk child, this is what you are. This is how the world will press upon you." Asterisk. Instead, the modern empath is handed a label, perhaps a prescription, and told to function in offices and supermarkets and digital feeds as if their nervous system were the same as everyone else's. It is not the same. It never was. The alchemists, who were not the foolish gold seekers later generations imagined them to be, but profound psychologists working in the symbolic language of their time, spoke often of a substance they called the asterisk prima materia, asterisk the first matter. It was, they said, despised. It was found in dunghills, in places no one wished to look. And yet from this despised matter, through the long suffering of the work, the gold was born. The empath sensitivity is, in this sense, of asterisk prima materia asterisk. The world calls it weakness. The world calls it instability. And yet it is from precisely this material, when it is honored, when it is worked with patience, that something extraordinary can emerge. But what emerges? This is the question that has occupied me for many years. What emerges when the empathic gift is integrated rather than suffered is a particular kind of perception. A perception that does not rely on words, on arguments, on the slow machinery of logical thought. The empath knows. They know the lie behind the smile. They know the grief behind the laughter. They know which marriages have died long before the divorce papers are filed. They know which children carry burdens their parents have refused to name. This is not magic. It is not the supernatural. In the cheap sense, the modern world uses that word. It is, rather, the operation of a layer of the psyche that the rational mind has dismissed and forgotten. I call this layer the unconscious, not the personal unconscious of repressed memories alone, but something deeper, something shared, the collective unconscious, the reservoir of human experience that flows beneath every individual life like an underground river. The empath has, by temperament or by fate, kept their well open to this river. What mythology has been trying to tell us for centuries is precisely this. The seers, the oracles, the wounded prophets, they were not exceptions to humanity. They were specialists within humanity. They held a function the tribe needed, and when the tribe forgot this function, the tribe began to die spiritually, even as it grew rich materially. Look at our age. We have built machines that can calculate faster than any mind. We have built networks that can connect every voice on the planet. And yet we are lonelier than any generation that has come before us. We have lost, in the great rush toward outer mastery, our capacity for inner listening. And so the empath in this age becomes more vital than ever and also more endangered than ever. More vital, because someone must still feel what the collective refuses to feel. Someone must still register the grief that the news cycle moves past in 20 seconds. Someone must still notice that the man on the train is breaking, that the child in the classroom is unraveling, that the entire society is in the grip of a sorrow it cannot name. More endangered, because the modern world is a perpetual assault on porous nervous systems. The screens, the notifications, the constant immersion in the unprocessed emotions of millions of strangers. The empath who does not learn to manage his flow will drown. Many do. They drown in addiction, in chronic illness, in depressions diagnosed as their own, when they were never their own to begin with. What Jung said about this is deeply unsettling. I once observed that modern man had lost his gods, but not his need for them. The same can be said of the empathic capacity. We have lost the cultural structures that once protected and trained the empath, but we have not lost the empaths themselves. They are still being born. They are simply being born into a world that has no idea what to do with them. Now let me turn to something more intimate. Let me speak of the inner journey. Because everything I have said until now is in a sense only preparation. The real work begins where description ends. If you are an empath, or if you suspect you might be, then there is a particular path that calls to you. I cannot give you a formula for it, because the soul does not move by formula, but I can describe its shape. The first movement of the path is the one I have already named. It is the work of distinguishing what is yours from what is not yours. This sounds simple. It is not. The empath has often spent decades fused with the emotional fields of others. The fusion has become, in many cases, the very ground of their identity. To begin to separate is, at first, terrifying. It feels like a betrayal. The empath asks, asterisk, if I no longer carry my mother's sadness, who am I? If I no longer absorb my partner's anxiety, will they still love me? These are real questions. The answer is not that one becomes cold. The answer is that one becomes useful. Because here is a paradox at the heart of the empath's journey, and it is a paradox the modern self-help literature almost always misses. The empath cannot truly help others until the empath has separated from others. The fused empath is not helpful. The fused empath is merely drowning alongside whoever they have fused with. It is only the differentiated empath, the one who can feel deeply without being swept away, who can offer something real. The lifeguard who jumps into the water without a rope drowns with the swimmer. This is the deepest thing I can tell you about empathy as a spiritual function. It is not pity. It is not enmeshment. It is not the dissolution of the self into the suffering of the other. It is rather the disciplined capacity to remain present, to remain whole, while another's pain passes through one's awareness. The empath who has done this work becomes a vessel, not a drain, not a sponge, but a vessel. The pain enters, it is witnessed, and it is released, transformed by the witnessing itself. The detail most people overlook hides precisely here. They think empathic gifts are about asterisk receiving more asterisk. The opposite is true. The mature empath learns to receive less, but to perceive more deeply what is received. The second movement of the path is the encounter with what I call the shadow. Now, the empath is often surprised when I bring up the shadow in this context. The empath thinks of themselves as kind, as caring, as concerned with others. What shadow could such a person possibly have? I will tell you, the empath's shadow is one of the most subtle in all of psychology. It is the shadow of the helper who needs to be needed. It is the shadow of the one who reads everyone else's pain so skillfully, because they have never dared to look at their own. It is the shadow of the rescuer who keeps choosing wounded partners because the wound is the only place they know how to live. It is the shadow of the martyr who collects their suffering as a kind of currency, exchanging it for love that never quite arrives. I do not say this to wound you. If you are an empath, I say it because no real growth is possible without it. The empath who refuses to face this shadow remains forever in a kind of holy adolescence, gifted, sensitive, suffering, and ultimately stuck. The empath who turns and faces the shadow, who admits asterisks. Yes, I have used my sensitivity as a hiding place. Yes, I have made my pain a virtue. Yes, I have feared my own anger and projected it onto others, asterisks. This empath begins to grow up. The real turning point begins right here. Because once the empath integrates their shadow, once they can hold their own anger, their own selfishness, their own ordinary human darkness, they no longer need to absorb the darkness of others to feel whole. They become finally themselves. And from this place of being themselves, their gift transforms. It stops being a wound that bleeds. It becomes a sense like sight, like hearing, that they can use with skill and intention. The third movement of the path is what I would call the discipline of the inner sanctuary. The empath, more than almost any other type of soul, must build for themselves a place of return. This is not a metaphor only. It is a daily practice. It is the morning silence before the world rushes in. It is the walk in nature where one's own pulse can be heard again. It is the journal where the day's absorbed emotions can be given back to whoever they belong to. It is the prayer or the meditation or the simple act of sitting by a window and watching the light change. Without this sanctuary, the empath is at the mercy of every passing storm. With it, the empath becomes something the world has rarely known how to receive, a person who feels everything and is destabilized by nothing. I have known a few such people in my life. They were not saints in any conventional sense. They were ordinary in their habits, modest in their words. But to be in their presence was to feel oneself become more real. They saw you, they felt you, and yet they were not pulled apart by you. They were rooted somewhere you could not see, and from that rootedness they could afford to be entirely open. This is what the empath is being called toward. Not to suffer more, not to feel more, but to root more deeply, so the feeling becomes a service rather than a sentence. Let me say something now about the spiritual dimension, because I have been circling it without naming it directly. I was in my long life often asked whether I believed in the soul. I gave many answers depending on who was asking. But I will tell you this, in my work with the empathic souls who came to me, I often had the distinct impression that I was meeting people who had not entirely arrived in this world. Some part of them was still elsewhere, still listening, still attuned, still woven into a fabric of being that the modern materialist could not see. They felt the presence of those who had died. They felt the mood of houses, of cities, of certain landscapes. They had what we might call in the old language, asterisk second sight asterisk. Not always in any dramatic supernatural way, but in the quiet way that some people simply know. I do not require you to believe anything about this. I only ask that you not dismiss it. The reductive science of our age has been confident in declaring such perceptions illusions. I have been less confident. I have seen too much. I have seen empaths predict deaths. I have seen them describe places they had never visited. I have seen them know things about my own inner life that I had not yet spoken aloud. I refuse to pretend I did not see what I saw. What I will say is this. The spiritual gifts that empaths often manifest, the intuitive knowing, the capacity to sense what is unseen, the apparent reception of information through channels unknown, these are not, in my view, supernatural. They are asterisks, natural asterisks. They are part of the original equipment of the human soul, equipment most of humanity has allowed to atrophy through disuse. The empath has kept the equipment functional. They are not freaks. They are reminders. Reminders of what we all once were. Reminders of what we might still be, if we care to remember. And here is the deepest paradox of all. The empath, who has so often been told they are too soft for the world, may in fact be the very figure the world most desperately needs. Not because the empath will save anyone. The empath cannot save anyone. But because the empath, by simply being what they are, holds open a door to a way of being human that we are very close to forgetting, a door to the soul. We live in an age that has become extraordinarily skilled at the management of attention and extraordinarily clumsy in the cultivation of presence. The empath, when they have done their work, embodies presence in a way that cannot be faked. They cannot pretend to listen. They cannot perform interest. When they meet you, they actually meet you. And in a world starved of real meeting, this is no small thing. It is perhaps the most quietly revolutionary thing a human being can offer. So if you are an empath, or if you suspect after this long evening that you might be one, let me leave you with a few thoughts. Not as instructions but as companions for the road. Honor your sensitivity. Do not call it weakness. Recognize it for what it is, an ancient capacity, a function the human family needs. But honor it without inflating it. You are not chosen. You are not special in the way the spiritual marketplace will try to sell you. You are simply built differently, and that difference carries both gift and responsibility. Learn the discipline of separation. Learn whose feelings you carry. Learn to give them back. Loving someone is not the same as drowning with them. The empath who cannot separate becomes a martyr, and the martyr serves no one in the long run, not even themselves. Build your sanctuary, not once. Find what restores you and treat it as sacred. Silence, nature, solitude, the right hour of the day when no one needs anything from you. These are not luxuries. They are the conditions of your continued usefulness to anyone, including yourself. Face your shadow. The empath has one, and it is subtle. Do not let your sensitivity become a fortress against self-knowledge. The kindest empath is still capable of cruelty, of avoidance, of self-deception. Know your own darkness. The light you offer others will be cleaner for it. And finally, accept that you may always be, in some way, a stranger in the world, not entirely. There will be people who see you, who recognize what you are. But the wider culture may never quite have a place for you. This is not your failure. It is the failure of an age that has forgotten what souls like yours are for. Do not bend yourself out of shape trying to fit. The world does not need more bent shapes. It needs people who can stand in their own truth and offer something real from that standing. The fire is lower now. And I find myself returning to that woman who came to my consulting room so many years ago. She did eventually find her way. She learned to distinguish her own feelings from those of the room she entered. She built her sanctuary. She faced her shadow with all its cunning helper disguises. And the last time I saw her, she had become something I can only describe as luminous. She was not loud. She was not impressive in any conventional way, but she was deeply, unmistakably herself. And in her presence, others became more themselves as well. This is what I wish for you. Not that your sensitivity should be cured, not that your gift should be amplified into some grand performance, but that you should become quietly, completely, irreducibly yourself. That your feelings should serve rather than consume. The world has not yet found its place for the empath. Perhaps it never will, but you can find your place in yourself. And from that place, everything you were ever meant to give, you will give. Not because you must, but because when you are rooted in who you are, the giving simply happens, as naturally as light from a candle. And so I leave you with a question, as I always do at the end of such evenings. A question to carry into your sleep, into the quiet hours where the deeper self speaks. When you next feel a great emotion rising in you, a sorrow, a fury, an inexplicable ache, will you ask before anything else the simple and life-changing question, asterisk, whose is this? Asterisk, and whatever answer arises, will you have the courage to listen? Sleep well. The night holds more than we know, and the soul, even in its sleeping, is never alone.